Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's truly an honour for me to begin this debate on my motion M151 for a national strategy to combat marine plastic pollution in our waters and on our shores. Canada has the largest coastline in the world. We have 20% of the world's fresh water and 60% of the world's lakes. This means that we not only rely on clean water, but we shoulder the responsibility of protecting it. This motion is the product of many hours of discussion with and between environmental advocacy groups, academics, small business, municipalities, First Nations and concerned Canadians, and I'm proud to bring their voices to this debate. This issue is very important to Canadians, and I've heard from impassioned elementary school students, seniors residents on doorsteps in coffee shops, at hockey games, at the grocery store checkout, and in town hall meetings. In addition to the hundreds of Canadians who have contacted my office directly and indirectly through postcards and emails and social media comments, they all want to see us advance this, Mr. Speaker. And I've personally spoken in this House or in committee more than 50 times on this issue. The time for talking about the state of our oceans has passed. We're here at the 11th hour of a crisis of our own making, and it's time for us as members of Parliament to reach across the floor and do what is right. This is not an issue unique to my riding, but has emerged as a major issue within Canada and around the world. And as a result, it is public engagement that has given birth to this motion, as Canadians have become more aware of the urgency of the marine plastics crisis. A recent poll conducted by Abacus Data found that 1 in 3 Canadians say that plastic in our oceans and waterways is one of the most important environmental issues today, and 88% believe it's an important issue, Mr. Speaker. Over 90% want government to regulate less plastics packaging and a reduction in the amount of plastic used in consumer products, and 96%, Mr. Speaker, support community cleanups. In the Great Lakes alone, over 500,000 pieces of microplastics per square kilometre is present. This is a huge task, and we cannot tackle it alone. The purpose of M151 is to initiate a national strategy in conjunction with municipalities, provinces and Indigenous communities and small business to reduce the industrial and consumer use of plastics and to remove plastic pollution in our waters. This motion seeks the development of a strategy to rethink and redesign Canada's plastic economy. The work of former Halifax Member of Parliament Megan Leslie and the current member for Windsor West, which resulted on a ban of microbeads in 2015. Their work demonstrates what we can achieve if we work together, and I'm grateful to my friend and colleague, the member from Victoria, for seconding this motion, my friend for his guidance and encouragement in its preparation. And I must also recognize and thank the members from Courtenay-Columbia, Nanaimo Ladysmith, Saanich Gulf Islands, and Beaches East York for seconding of the motion, and my colleagues from the NDP caucus who've been very supportive of this motion. Our fisheries rely on a clean marine environment. We know from science that if plastics in our ocean are not removed, they will continue to degrade, eventually entering our ecosystems and food chain. We also know that animals that eat microplastics have lower reproductive success. The motion draws on the work of Professor Calvin Sanborn and his students at the University of Victoria's Environmental Law Centre and consists of 7 reforms which outline a blueprint for federal action on reducing and removing plastic pollution in our waters. Ocean plastics is a global environmental challenge, and yet Canada has no national policy to prevent plastics from entering our waters and no mechanisms to support the cleanup of existing pollution. Canada needs a strategy that leads us to legislation and regulations to address the crisis of marine plastic pollution. Through the Federal Oceans Protection Plan, although it purports to protect our coast, it makes no mention of plastics or marine debris whatsoever. Further, it does not address land-based debris and plastics, which account for almost 80% of ocean plastics. Sadly, Canada lags behind our global neighbours. 40 countries around the world have already created strategies to curb plastic use. Most notably, last week, the European Union passed a landmark resolution to ban single-use plastics by 2021. This starts with cleaning up our oceans. Plastic must be recovered from our waters before it breaks down and enters the ecosystem and our food chain. The issue of large-scale marine plastic pollution hit home for me in November 2016 when 35 empty shipping containers spilled from the Hanjin-Seattle cargo ship in rough seas near the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The people of Tofino, Ahousaht, Ucluelet, Heshquit, Tloquid, Huet, Toquat, and Ucluelet on the west coast of Vancouver Island became quickly aware of large sheets of metal with foam pieces washing onto our shores and breaking up into smaller and smaller pieces. All of these communities rely heavily on a healthy marine environment, and threats like this are taken very seriously. The immediate concern of local leaders, the business community, and local environmental champions was recovery and cleanup, as high tides and storm surf tossed logs at the top of our beaches, grinding the styrofoam into tiny pieces. Cleaning up hundreds of kilometers of our precious shoreline was top of mind for everyone. The work began immediately. Volunteers with Clackwood Cleanup, Surfrider Pacific Rim, Ocean Legacy, and legions of local residents were activated. They were joined by many others who traveled to our coast from afar to undertake the monumental task of cleanup. Regrettably, funds were not made available from the federal government to support their work. It was sweat equity of the highest order. Officials told us that there is a legislative and regulatory void, and our communities were essentially left out on their own. Only $72,000 was recovered from the shipping company through the courts, through the Shipping Act, but even these funds weren't immediately made available. So the work went ahead with personal risks taken by many volunteers as they collected and bagged several tons of debris for eventual pickup. Eventually, a portion of the expenses incurred in the cleanup were reimbursed, but only $15,000, a fraction of the total cost, was released to one of the environmental groups working on the cleanup. The rest of the money is still sitting here, Mr. Speaker, in Ottawa, almost 2 years later. Our nation owes an ongoing debt of gratitude to the many Canadians who respond in this way when our environment is threatened. My investigation of this single incident led me to an informal network of environmental nonprofits, education institutions, local governments, First Nations, and include Canadians deeply concerned about marine plastic pollution. No question that the Hanjin spill and similar threats can be devastating to the local marine environment. They told me, but this is the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Our marine environment is under threat on a global scale, Mr. Speaker. Upwards of 20 million tons of debris enters the world's oceans every year. It is estimated that the equivalent of one garbage truck of plastic enters our oceans every minute, every day. On average, there are 18,000 pieces of plastic floating in every square kilometer of the ocean globally. And 80% of all plastic in the ocean comes from land-based sources. 90% of plastic in the ocean is microplastics, and 95% of single-use plastics are only used once and discarded. Global plastic pollution has doubled in the last 20 years and is expected to double again in the next 20 years. And by 2050, if this trend continues, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. One study found that the returning adult BC salmon ingest up to 90 pieces of plastic each day. And shellfish, we're finding over 2 pieces of microplastic in every piece of shellfish from our communities. Each year, plastic litter kills more than 1 million seabirds and 100,000 marine mammals such as turtles, dolphins, whales, and seals. And over 260 species of animals have been found to be entangled or killed by harmful marine species. Many of the volunteers who took to the beaches after the Hanjin spill were already well aware of these sad realities, of course. In fact, at the time of the Hanjin spill, the United Nations was only months away from announcing its Clean Seas Initiative, and Canada was less than a year away from joining it as a voluntary signatory. And since then, barely a day has passed without multiple media reports of new findings about marine plastic pollution, each one more alarming than the last. Today, the average Canadian high school student knows more about the threat of ocean plastic than most members of this House knew at the time of the Hanjin spill only 2 years ago. So public awareness and consumer engagement is critical, of course, and the government is to be congratulated on its development of education tools and curricula recently on plastic pollution. This is absolutely important and critical element of a national strategy. So what else? We need clear binding targets for the reduction of marine plastics pollution in collaboration with provincial, territorial, municipal and Indigenous governments. We need national standards and best practices to help meet national reduction targets, and we need to incentivize other levels of government to adopt them. Federal leadership is essential, including the coordination and funding of interjurisdictional efforts to meet these targets. Legislation needs to be identified in a national strategy to address those aspects of this marine plastic issue that are clearly within the federal jurisdiction. And marine plastic pollution should be placed on the agenda of the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, along with a commitment to facilitate technological transfers between governments across this country in order to meet national targets. A federal commitment to build on Canada's Zero Plastics Waste Charter initiative is required to set a global example by fighting marine plastic pollution decisively here at home. A ban on plastic straws shouldn't come at the expense of accessibility. Exceptions should be made in the form of biodegradable plastic straws. Let's all challenge ourselves to look at the world through other lenses to create a more inclusive, accessible, and environmentally friendly world. We need a commitment to measure our progress on marine plastics pollution by developing effective measurement criteria and regularly reporting to Parliament on its progress. The University of Victoria Environmental Law Centre has identified important specific regulatory policies that are also essential elements of a national strategy. One, single-use plastics make up the most of plastic debris on our beaches, and we must adopt policies that reduce both consumer and industrial use of single-use plastics. We're seeing Europe take that step, Mr. Speaker. Kenya has banned plastic bags. Cities across North America are taking action and leading. Second, we need plastic debris we know ends up in the ocean via storm drains that carry urban runoff to the sea. Our national strategy must reduce plastic discharge from stormwater outfalls. Los Angeles is already implementing that, Mr. Speaker. And microbeads, third, microbeads, nurdles, pre-production plastic pellets, microfibers shed by synthetic fabrics, degraded plastic particles, and polystyrene fragments permeate the marine environment and could pose more risk than larger plastic debris. And our national strategy must reduce microplastic pollution. In San Francisco, they've even banned polystyrene and styrofoam from their docks, Mr. Speaker, so they're taking leadership. And lost or abandoned plasticized fishing and aquaculture gear takes hundreds of years to decompose. Removing ghost gear from our oceans and preventing further gear loss is a crucial element of a national strategy. Mr. Speaker, Washington, Oregon, California have all taken leadership, removing thousands of tons of ghost fishing gear. Fifth, we require plastic producers to finally take responsibility for the full life cycle costs of their products and packaging. And we need them to internalize cleanup costs that have been borne by individual Canadians or their governments. A marine pollution strategy must extend plastic producer responsibility. And sixth, the University of Victoria Environmental Law Centre observes that tackling marine plastic pollution effectively will require replacing new plastic production with a non-wasteful circular or closed-loop system that reduces overall use and also maximizes reuse. Canada's plastic economy must be redesigned. And finally, the University of Victoria study recommends that education, outreach, and beach cleanups are of critical importance. Beach cleanups serve as a form of downstream management of marine litter. They engage citizen involvement and contribute to behavior change. Currently, the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup occurs across the country on World Environment Day with support from Environment and Climate Change Canada. But without a question, more support is required from all levels of government for beach cleanups throughout the year, not just one day, Mr. Speaker. And since this motion was introduced a year ago, Canadians across this country have demanded that we take an active role in creating a plastic economy that is sustainable and accountable for the waste that it generates. Support for a comprehensive national strategy that includes meaningful funding to promote the important work already underway that advances plastic reduction policies is coming from municipalities, First Nations, environmental groups, churches, corporations, and individual citizens. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, in October, the Union of British Columbia Municipalities passed a nearly unanimous resolution in support of this motion at its annual meeting. And the Federation of Canadian Municipalities passed a similar motion with support of over 90% earlier this year. In my riding alone, bylaws that regulate plastics have been initiated or passed by many municipalities. So, Mr. Speaker, in closing, we know that many people are supporting this motion. Some of us did a petition, 120,000 signatories signed it in a matter of just a few weeks, which we delivered to the minister. I want to take the opportunity to thank all of the signatories of those petitions. Their voice matters today, and others like Margaret Atwood and hundreds of other community champions, school children, church leaders, and just plain folks that have spoken up in support of the motion. I need to thank them. But most importantly, I need to thank those that have been on the ground working on this issue, Mr. Speaker. And if I could, thank the communities and organizations that have helped me prepare this motion, including Communities to Protect Our Coast from Oceanside, Clackwood Cleanup, Surfrider Pacific Rim, the Association of Denman Island Marine Stewards, Surfrider Vancouver Island, Ocean Legacy, Some of Us, T-Buck Suzuki Environmental Foundation, the University of Environmental Law Centre, and the Ucluelet Aquarium. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.